But this travel survey is really a method that is most useful for the city or state level. And we cannot get down to the facility level with that data. So that's the big problem with that approach. Okay, well, with all these problems, now let's not get too depressed. There is hope and there is progress. So we are improving the count program. The Washington State Department of Transportation is actively improving their count program and as I said, expanding their permanent counters. And we also want to work with them in the future to remove bias if we're going to use this approach. And then travel surveys, if we could get a larger sample using the National Travel Survey or doing a state-specific survey, that would be useful. And then there are other data sources that we explored in this study that I did not mention, but one of the most promising there are the GPS apps. If we can integrate those with the count data, we could get a better way of filling in the gaps between where we have actual counts, because we cannot afford to count everywhere. So lots of future research and future areas where we can expand and do a better job of counting and measuring bicycling and walking. Specifically, for those who would like to improve their permanent count program, which I think is a great idea, we want to expand and include diverse geographic areas, rural and mountain regions, as well as urban regions. We want to count on both paths and roads, and sometimes that's difficult. It's sometimes easier to count on paths, but we also want to count on roads. We want to choose sites selectively, not randomly, but selectively for the permanent count sites. We want to choose sites, and that's important because we need to choose sites that work for these automated equipment and sites with moderate to high volumes. Now the problem is we do need to still sample in rural areas where volumes are low, and so for the time being we will have to put these counters in low volume areas. But if possible, if there are any higher or moderate volume areas, those are easier to work with the data, because if you only have 5 people going by per day, it's pretty hard to do statistics with that. But for rural areas and mountain regions, we will have low count locations, and that's okay. We need to separate bicycle and pedestrian counts because pedestrians and bicyclists have different travel patterns, and the state of Washington is doing that. It's good to see. And we need to install at least 1 permanent counter per strata. I talked about these strata, but per region and facility type. And ideally, I'd like to see 7 per factor group. So factor group means the behavior. So if you have a commute pattern, for example, that is a factor group. A commute pattern in this region, that's 1 factor group. The recreational pattern in that region is another factor group. So that would mean a lot of counting. But I think bicycling and walking, the patterns we're seeing are more variable than what we see for motor vehicles, so it is appropriate to install perhaps even more permanent counters for these modes than we have historically had for driving. Okay, I asked my current grad student who is working with the current data, to give some input on, his name is Dylan Johnstone, to give some input on what we can do better for this data. And he mentioned we want to document any equipment malfunctions and special events that happen, because someone looking at the data later may not know that you had a really great event on your path and may think that large spike is a problem. So if you can document that, that would be helpful. And taking photos of the site is very helpful, even the short duration count sites, so that future researchers can know better what type of facility it was on, where exactly the counting was done. And then validate your equipment. Even if you validate it, you find a problem, you fix the problem, recalibrate it again, validate it again, and because we need to know, well, it's better, but it's probably still not 100%. So what is that error associated with that? Is it an undercount, or what's going on, so that you can account for that better? And there's great information on NCHRP 797 report that's available for free online. I have all these references at the end of the presentation. Okay, short duration counters, what can we do better? So for the purpose I'm talking about, it is useful to have a random stratified sampling approach. So we've talked about how those strata could be chosen and then sampling randomly around your network. And we don't have to count at every location every year. We can rotate those locations just like we do for motor vehicles. If we have the good set of permanent counters, the permanent counters are telling us how travel varies with time. The short duration counters are telling us how does travel vary over space. They have a different purpose. So we don't have to rely on those to tell us, they should not be telling us what's going on over time. They should be telling us what's going on over space. So we can rotate those and not have to sample the same site every year. And that'll allow us to find out what's going on around our network better instead of being stuck counting the same site every year. And I'd ideally like to expand these short duration count programs to cover at least 150 short duration count sites per group. And ideally, we'd want to count 7 days per site using some automated equipment like a tube counter and a infrared counter. As we see at the bottom of the page, here's the tube counter and the infrared counter. And using those together, if you count with the infrared counter, it counts all the warm bodies, and the tube counter can count the bicycles, and then you could subtract the warm bodies from the tubes to theoretically get an estimate of pedestrians, which again is very nice. But you don't have to do that. And sometimes, for example, this is a pedestrian-only trail. You've separated the pedestrians out in a different way. So that can also work. You don't have to count the same mode, for both modes at the same site. So ideally we do 7 days per site. That's what researchers, including myself, have found. But I'm still not willing to give up on the shorter manual counts. Manual counts have their place. You can understand the helmet wearing, you can get gender, other variables that you cannot get with an automated equipment at this time. So I think these all have their place, and we're working on a study right now to understand what the error associated with doing these estimates that I've talked about in this presentation. What is the error with doing those short-term manual counts and estimating your annual average daily bicycle and pedestrian traffic? I think in the best conditions, when we count in September on peak hours and we know what the pattern is, I think we can really minimize that error, and it may not be as bad as we think. So I'm not giving up on these manual counts, but in a perfect world, yeah, sure, I'd love to have 7 days, because then I know, do we have highs on weekends or do we have highs on weekdays? And I know what's going on throughout the day. Do we have a peak at commute hours or during the middle of the day? So ideally, we should count longer, but let's not give up on manual counts. Okay, and we can combine these. We can do both. Okay, and counting separately, pikes and pets. Travel survey, a simple approach could be to just expand the oversampling for the National Household Travel Survey, or you could establish a statewide household travel survey. If all you care about is the state level, this is probably an easy way to get there. But again, it's not going to get you to the facility level and those answers that you need for other purposes. GPS data, this is just an example of the Strava website. There are other apps out there, Ride Report, Ride with GPS, many other apps out there collecting this data. Some of them are specific to states, but do not think, okay, Krista showed this graph, this map, you can go online, it's free, just, oh, now your problems are solved. And you do have to pay for the data if you want the detailed data. But this data is nice and helpful, but it should not be used in isolation. It needs to be combined with the count data because the count data give you your ground truth. And when you relate that to something, another data source like this, then you can start doing estimates, filling in the gaps where your count data are not giving you information. But to use this in isolation without the other data and without understanding the bias of the users of these particular apps, because these are not randomly selected users in general, unless you've done a specific study, we need to understand that bias and we need to account for it properly. So count data are the basis for all of these other estimates and combining these other data. Okay. Next steps, we are continuing to work on this. Thankfully, the Washington DOT has continued to fund research on this. I'm working with Dr. Mike Lowry at the University of Idaho on our next steps. We are going to write a guidebook for communities and take what we're learning about when to count. We're currently making more factors with all this extra data that the Washington Department of Transportation has provided. We're studying when is the best time to count, and Mike Lowry is studying where is the best place to count, and then we're going to create a guidebook based on that research. So look for that in the coming year. I just wanted to provide some of the free references that are available on the web so that if you want to know more about counting, about some of the things I've talked about, here are some great resources. And so I'm just going to wrap up and thank again NHTSA for their help, Washington DOT, folks at University of North Carolina Highway Safety Research Center, who are I'm continuing to work with here, and also Portland State, who has helped us out with this research. And I think Mike Sellinger may be on the line, and we can add him in for this question and answer session because he may be able to add some knowledge since he worked on this very much. Okay, thank you so much for your attention.
Great, thank you, Krista. It was a great presentation. And that's very exciting to hear about that guidebook. I think a lot of people will be interested in that when that comes out. All right, we'll go ahead and we've got a few questions here. So continue to submit your questions if you have them, but I'll go ahead and get started with a few questions that we already have. So one question is a general question, and you've sounds like most of the data is pretty generalized and could be easily transferred to other states. Is there any pitfalls to watch out for or highlights as people may want to transfer this kind of information or data collection to their state or jurisdiction?
Sure. So I think the methods are very transferable. I talked about this sampling method, and that's something that you could do anywhere. You can do it on the smaller scale, on the city level. You could do it on the county level. You could do it on the state level. And again, if you're working on the state level, using some of these secondary data sets to fill in some of the gaps may be useful, especially when it's so hard to get all the count data right away. But one thing I do want to caution is I put some numbers in here that were specific to that one location in Washington State on that Fremont Bridge. Those were the factors we came up with to illustrate how to do that, not to be used by others, because obviously that particular set of numbers is really only appropriate for that year, 2012, and for the area around the Fremont Bridge in Seattle.
Okay, great. And it looks like we have a few questions regarding the GPS data that you had mentioned. So one question is, how much does it cost, and is it difficult to process? And then similarly, have you compared any of the GPS data counts to permanent counters, and did you see a difference? And then finally, have you tried to create a Strava using some of the tube count factor based on the Strava Metro data that they've purchased?
Oh wow, lot to that question. Okay, that's a very good question, and the answer is no, I have not personally done this. However, there are researchers out there who are doing it and continue to work on that particular approach. Luis Miranda Moreno, for example, at McGill, his team is working on that. Other researchers have also worked on it. Okay, let's start with the beginning. So how much does it cost? I do not know. I do know that Oregon Department of Transportation and other departments of transportation have purchased it, so you'd have to ask Strava Metro. And how hard is it to process? I have heard that from the vendor, they have told me that, oh yes, we will make it very easy for you and provide it in the, in a GIS that would be useful to you. So that's what the vendor says. So I think we'll have to ask someone who has used that. Perhaps, I don't know if someone's on the call who's already worked with that data, maybe they can write into the chat pad about what they've learned. And other types of data of this sort. So many of you may be familiar with other apps that were open source originally in San Francisco. They came up with an app to do some tracking, and that app has been used by many researchers around the country and into Canada to create their own specific apps for their jurisdiction. For example, Oregon has OR Cycle, and I think Puget Sound has their own app. So, and Cycle Atlanta, and anyway, it goes on and on. There are many, many agencies using some version of this app, and research has been done in Georgia and Oregon and many places to look at that type of data. But for all of these, whether you're using the private data or a public data source, you still have the bias that you have to account for. And you have to know who are using these and how that bias may be influencing how you're filling in the gaps between your count data. So the count data are really key to understanding, am I getting a good sample of the urban riders, or am I only getting recreational users? Or am I only getting urban riders and you know, some of these are really for people who are cycling advocates. They're marketed towards cycling advocates, or they're marketed towards college students. So that's going to bias your sample, and understanding how your GPS data is biased in that way is really important when you're using these types of data. But it is a promising data source. If you are interested in understanding what's going on in your city or in your campus area, then it's a pretty good way to saturate users. And if you have a group of people who are using iPhones a lot, then you might be able to get pretty good numbers. So on the state level, though, I think it's great for sampling. Like the Strava data really appeals to people who like to do recreational riding, and so that could be very useful when you're looking at state level rural roads where we have a real challenge with count data. So there's definitely a place for it, and I'm glad to see a lot of research going on in that area.
Okay, and we have a couple responses from the audience, so I'll just go ahead and read those quickly with their experiences. So the way I got it was a GIS layer for the street network and a table of user link counts for each minute of the year, which for the city of San Francisco was a 3 gigabyte table for 1 year, so bigger than you can handle in Excel by quite a bit. And then another response was, the company does roll up the data into times of day, AM rush, midday, PM rush, etc., and they split the data out by month and weekday, weekend. It is still a little cumbersome to work with and requires a fair amount of GIS processing. If you want to get down to the minute or hour, it requires more advanced SQL skills. So, thank you for your feedback. All right, and so let's move on to another question here. So, let's see here. Do you tie evaluation of bike ped needs based on land use and zoning? Isn't this what ADT methods for traffic? Also, is there any data to determine bike storage, bike racks, lockers, etc., based on land use?
Okay, so that last question, I have looked at the counts from bike parking and thought about using that, but I never have because it's more of an origin destination question. It's a different type of data. So you don't know where those folks went, you just know where they ended up. So it's a little challenging to use when you're trying to figure out how many people are on this bike path or how many people are on this bike lane or how many people are on that sidewalk. And especially for pedestrians, obviously that wouldn't give you much information. Can you read the first part of the question again?
Yeah. Do you tie evaluation of bike ped needs based on land use and zoning?
Yeah, so that's why we were looking in this study at the land use, and we did explore the option of getting more into land use. But again, we were focusing on the state level, and because of our focus on the state level, we just took that and very generalized. So we did not look at getting down to commercial versus residential neighborhoods. And I think when you're talking about pedestrian travel and you're looking at the city level, then that becomes more interesting and more useful. But on the state level, we needed something that was a little simpler. So urban versus rural and maybe suburban, if we had a good definition for that.
Okay, great. And then we have a specific question on one of your slides on the better data needed. You had mentioned 150 short duration count sites per group. And on this slide, what does group mean in that context?
Good question. Good question. So I was talking about the strata that I mentioned earlier, where we have the urban-rural, the geographic, and we had the 24 strata, 4 geographic regions for the state, and then the 3 types of facilities. So that's what that meant. Thanks for the clarifying question.
Great. Okay. Another question here. How do you see the PSU Bike Ped Traffic Data Portal making statewide activity estimations more doable?
Well, it's a source for this data, and you know, people who know me know that one of the reasons I enjoyed so much being at PSU is I got to work on the Bike Ped data archive, Bike Ped portal, where we're taking count data from around the country and putting it in one place. And I think this is a very powerful concept because when we can aggregate data, we can really make the best use of it. So for example, for Washington State, when we looked in the follow-up research project, we've been looking around the state for additional count data in addition to the short duration count sites and the permanent counters that Washington Department of Transportation has. We found that in 2010 there was a parks department north of Seattle that was gathering all sorts of permanent count data on their trails, and we are able to use that for research. And then the city of Olympia has been gathering short duration count sites using tube counts to count bicycles on their road network and path network. And we found counters in Spokane and Redmond. So there was a wealth of data, and I think this is true for most states. Whenever I've looked into other data sources for count data other than just the state DOT, I'm always amazed at how many parks departments and cities and counties are collecting this type of data, but you won't get it until you ask. And Bike Ped Portal provides a place for us to start putting that. And it's also working on the National Bicycle and Pedestrian Documentation Project, which I haven't really talked about, but has been kind of the basis for a lot of this work. So Bike Ped Portal is working with the National Bicycle and Pedestrian Documentation Project and ALTA to take that data and start putting it in one centralized database so that researchers and others can start using it with all of these other data sources that are now available. So combining the permanent count sites and the short duration count sites. So one of the outcomes of the research we're currently working on will be to create this estimation procedure built into BikePed Portal so that you can estimate annual average daily traffic from at your short duration count sites using factors like the ones I've talked about. So a lot of great work going on and a lot of excitement in this area, and when we have a platform that we can help us do these analyses, it will definitely make them easier for everyone.
Great. That's very exciting. Kind of segueing into that, accounting for bias, is there any tips or thoughts on how you can account for bias in either the GPS data or for the sample-based data that you had mentioned that may be higher than statewide counts?
So how to account for it? So I'll talk about the GPS data first. So with the GPS data, this is the value of the count data. You can use that, compare it to your numbers, as one of the previous questioners was asking, have I done this? And others fortunately are. I think someone, Josh Roll at ODOT is actually working on this as well. So taking those count numbers, comparing them to the number of GPS traces on that segment, what's that relationship? And once you can understand that and see, is it a consistent relationship? Is it something we can account for? That's research that's ongoing right now, and answering that question is going to be really important for using GPS tracking data in the future. So I'm glad to see other researchers working on that. I look forward to hearing what they find, and yeah, it's a great question. Now, the other question was the bias on the count data. And that's a little harder because, like I said, we need to do a random sampling approach to overcome that. So I encourage jurisdictions who want to do that to do random sampling.
Okay. All right, and I think we have time for one more question here. Is camera video data viable for counts or estimates?
Good question. Yes and no. Yes, if you can prove that it is working. And unfortunately, we've at Portland State, when I was there, we did some studies and we were not able to prove that. So I think it has great promise and it can work, but we need to keep working on it, because what I've seen is if you can get it calibrated for one site pretty well if you work at it, but then trying to just put that camera up and get that same accuracy, it's challenging. So definitely an area of further development.
This is Mike Hellinger. One thing to add on to that, we are currently at Alta testing out the MioVision video collection unit in a bunch of different contexts and collection sites, and so we'll be releasing the results of that on and validating those counts to see how accurate they are.
Great. Thanks, Mike.
Great. All right. Well, thank you everyone for your questions. There were a few questions left unanswered, so we will make sure to just respond to those, and we'll also send out the video and Krista's presentation slides. So this concludes our webinar. Thank you for joining us, and thanks again, Krista, for sharing your work. You can also view other professional development offerings on our website, nitsi.trek.pdx.edu, and this concludes our webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day.